Alvin Plantinga, no doubt will arrive. Alvin Plantinga has called the argument which I'm going to discuss the argument from colours and flavours. But colours and flavours, understood as sensations of colour and flavour, are just one kind of what I call pure mental events. And I propose to treat this argument as an argument from pure mental events of all kinds to the existence of God. Because of the extreme shortage of time, I have to begin with certain assumptions which are contested, but not, in my view, properly contestable. But here they go. I'm going to assume that in order to tell the whole history of the world, we would need to list both those events to which one person has privileged access by experiencing them, and also the events to which no one person has privileged access. And I shall call events of the former kind mental events, and those of the latter kind physical events. By a subject having privileged access to an event, I mean that the event is such that whatever ways other people have of discovering whether or not it occurs, the subject can also use those ways, but has a way of her own of discovering this not available to others, that is, by experiencing it. For example, pain is, in my view, a mental event. You can discover whether I'm in pain by studying my behavior, perhaps also by studying my brain. But I could study my behavior, I could study my brain, I could study my behavior on a film, I could look at my brain through some complicated piece of apparatus, but of course I have a further way of knowing that I'm in pain, viz. By having the pain. So that is what makes it a mental event. On the other hand, the presence of a desk here is not a mental event because nobody has privileged access to it. Anyone can find out about it as well as anyone else. Among mental events are pure mental events. Those are ones which do not include any physical event. Thus, my seeing the desk is a mental event because I am experiencing it, and I know better than you whether I am seeing it. But its occurrence entails the existence of the desk, and that is a physical event. So, seeing the desk is a mental event, but not a pure mental event, whereas apparently seeing the desk, or seeming to see the desk, or believing one is seeing the desk is a pure mental event. When I mention mental events in future, I'm talking about pure mental events. Among such events are beliefs, occurrent thoughts, intentions, desires, and sensations. Sensations, thoughts, and intentions are occurrences of which necessarily someone who has them at a time is to some extent conscious of having them at a time. You can't have the thought that today is Saturday without to some extent being conscious that you're having the thought that today is Saturday. Beliefs and desires, by contrast, are what I call continuing mental states. That is to say, states which may continue to exist while the subject is quite unconscious of them, but they are mental because we can become conscious of them if we choose. Fairly evidently, to my mind, sensations, thoughts, beliefs, and desires are all caused, many of them directly and many of them indirectly, that is to say, via other beliefs, by brain events. Also, to my mind fairly evidently, pure mental events often cause other pure mental events. We believe some proposition because we believe another proposition. And it also seems to me that, I should add that it seems pretty obvious to me that all the kinds of events which I've mentioned are in fact caused, apart possibly from sensations, but apart possibly from intentions. But in the case of intentions, we're clearly influenced to have the intentions we do by various things, although I'm perfectly happy to say we're not fully caused. Likewise, it seems fairly obvious to me that our intentions, and I'm talking about the intentions in what we do, not our intentions for the future, my intention in moving my hand and so on, it's fairly obvious to me that the intention to do something, which is trying to do something, is efficacious often. It often makes a difference to our bodily movements by making a difference to our brains. Despite the fact that there's been a lot of neuroscience suggesting that isn't the case, I think that neuroscience is badly mistaken and can't possibly show what it purports to do. So those are the assumptions with which I'm beginning. They are assumptions about the nature of my data. That is to say, that there are pure mental events, and the sort of things we normally call desires, beliefs, and so on are among them, and that they are often caused by brain events and possibly via other mental events. Mental events cause other mental events, and mental events often cause brain events, and so other bodily events. That is my datum, contestable, but to my mind obvious. Now, moving on, the argument from the existence of such events, and so, given their causal relations to which I have alluded, the existence and their causal relations of these would be scientifically explicable if we had psychophysical laws. And it's reasonable to suppose that there are such psychophysical laws because these are regular processes. Okay, just a sec. Lost something there. Yes. The argument I'm going to give is an argument that to suppose that there are psychophysical laws and that they are the ultimate laws is very improbable a priori. But it is fairly probable that if there is a God, there would be these psychological laws, and therefore the existence of them is evidence for the existence of God. Right. What makes a scientific theory, such as a theory of mechanics, able to explain a diverse set of mechanical phenomena is that the laws of mechanics all deal with the same sort of thing, physical objects, and they concern only a few of their properties, such as mass, shape, size, position, and so on, which differ from each other in measurable ways. For example, one object may have twice as much mass as another, or be 3 times as long as another. Because of the values of these measurable properties are affected only by the values of a few other such properties, we can have a few general laws, which relate 2 or more such measured properties in all objects by a mathematical formula. We do not merely have to say that while an inelastic object of 100 grams mass and 10 meters moving at 10 meters per second collides with an inelastic object of 200 grams mass moving at 5 feet per second, such and such results, with quite unconnected formulae for the results of collisions of other innumerable inelastic objects of different masses and velocities, we can have a general formula, a law stating that for every pair of inelastic objects in collision, the quantity of the sum of the mass multiplied by its velocity plus the mass of the second multiplied by its velocity is always conserved. So we don't have to have special laws for things of mass 10 grams and another law for things of mass 10.1 gram. We can have a general formula connecting a few properties by in a mathematical way. But that can only hold if mass and velocity can be measured on scales, for example, of grams and meters per second. And we can extend mechanics to a general physics to include a few more measurable quantities, charge, spin, color charge, and so on, which interact with the mechanical quantities to construct a theory which makes testable predictions. So it's characteristic of a scientific theory to have a few simple laws relating measurable quantities of a few variables. A psychophysical theory, in other words, a theory with these laws of interaction of brain events, mental events, to mental events to other brain events. A psychophysical theory, however, would need to deal with things of very different kinds. Brain events differ from each other in the chemical elements involved in them, which in turn differ from each other in measurable ways, and they differ in the velocity and direction of the transmission of electric charge. But pure mental events do not have any of these properties, nor can most of them be analyzed in terms of common elements of their own. Being sweet, a character of a sensation, does not differ from being blue or even from being loud or red or even from being sour in having more or less of some common element. The intentional, or as I shall call them, propositional events, that is, the remaining mental events, beliefs, desires, thoughts, intentions, which consist of an attitude to a proposition, these events are what they are and have the influence they do in virtue of their propositional content. My belief that today is Saturday is what it is in virtue of its content, that today is Saturday, and it has the influence it does in virtue of that content. For example, combined with a belief that I've committed myself to give a lecture on Saturday and the desire to fulfill my obligations, it leads to my giving the lecture. While the content can be expressed in a language, and so different propositional events do consist of attitudes to things consisting of common elements, that is, the different concepts expressed by the different words of sentences of the language, although these propositional events are made up of elements which also appear in other propositional events, there are an enormous number of such elements, not interdefinable. Just consider how few of the words which occur in a dictionary can be defined adequately by other words in the dictionary, and so the same must hold for the concepts which they express. Propositional events have relations of deductive logic to each other, and some of these deductive relations determine in part the identity of the propositional event. My belief that all men are mortal wouldn't be that belief if I also believed that Socrates was an immortal man, and my thought that 2 plus 2 equals 4 wouldn't be the thought it is if I didn't also believe that 2 equals 1 plus 1, 3 equals 2 plus 1, and 4 equals 3 plus 1. So every token belief comes in a package with many other beliefs. You can't have a belief on its own without a lot of other beliefs going with it. Every token belief comes in a package with many other beliefs which it entails. And the same type belief belongs to many different packages. For example, consider 2 beliefs whose content is expressed in English by "this is square" and "this is 4 sides." Someone couldn't hold the first belief without holding the second, so the second must belong to any package to which the first belongs. However, the second belief, "this has 4 sides," must belong to many other packages as well. For example, the package containing the belief, "this is a rectangle." Yet there is no simple law determining which propositional events picked out by the sentence of a language which expresses them. There is no simple general law determining which propositional events belong to which packages, that is, which beliefs entail which other beliefs. It needs all the rules of a language which relate the concepts of that language to each other in order to express what are the relations between propositions, and all those rules can't be captured by a few rules of the language, because the deductive relations between sentences, and so the propositions which they express, are so complicated that it needs all the rules contained in a grammar of the language to express them. These rules are independent rules and do not follow from a few more general rules. Consider in how many different ways describable by the grammar of the language, words can be put together so as to form sentences with different kinds of meaning, and so the same must hold for the propositions which they express. And there is a further problem, that is, that we all, not all, but many of us, mean by a given word something very slightly different from what somebody else means by the given word. A very simple example might be the word table. We don't all mean the same by the word table. Some people would count this as a table. Well, it's a surface you can put things on. On the other hand, it's a rather special sort of surface, so maybe it isn't a table. So many people understand the same word of English in many different ways, and therefore any rules governing the mental events which they have will have to be special for them. Follows from all this that there must be innumerable different laws relating brain events to mental events, since there are just so many kinds of mental events, the ones you can have, the ones I can have, and all the beliefs and desires and so on which you could have, and all the beliefs, desires and so on which I could have, which come in packages, come together, and these are not related by any general formula to each other. Right. And on the other hand, brain events. Now, in consequence, any laws relating brain events to mental events will have to relate large brain events to large mental events, because the beliefs, etc., come in packages. They'll have to be large mental events, and therefore, clearly, there'll have to be large brain events which gave rise to them. There is no brain event, and couldn't be a brain event, which just produced the belief today is Saturday. It has to go with a lot of other things. And at the same time, of course, as me having that belief, I'm having certain thoughts and sensations, and it all comes together in one big mental event. And it's that that has to be related to the brain events. But since we all have different kinds of mental events, a true psychophysical theory will have to give the brain basis of all the different, for each mental event, each package of mental events which any one of you or anyone in the world can have, there will have to be a separate brain event which gives rise to that. So innumerable laws, not interconnected. And the same applies not merely to the propositional events, but to the sensations. They too are not interdefinable. Any laws relating brain events to sensation events will not follow from any general law about how kinds of brain events relate to kinds of sensations. So, a psychophysical theory would consist of an enormous number of separate laws, not derivable from a few more general laws, laws relating large brain events with numerically measurable values of transmission of electric charge in various circuits, on the one hand, to large, conscious and non-conscious states consisting of beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on, with the content individuated by the sentences of a language, varying in its words and grammar slightly for each person. And you can't even measure these mental events. At least you can measure them relative to each other. Somebody can have a belief that's stronger than another belief. Someone can have a sensation that is stronger than another belief. But there's no absolute value of just how strong a sensation is, and there can't be any absolute value of just how strong a belief is, because in order to have absolute values, you have to have a ruler of some sort that can be put alongside what you're measuring. And the ruler would have to be a public thing, but you can't put a ruler alongside a belief and see how strong it is. Okay, so you get this picture, and the picture is as this picture of what happens in the case of psychophysical laws. Brain events, many different ones, give rise to sensations, and at the same time they give rise to beliefs, and it's a bit more complicated than that because beliefs give rise to other beliefs, and they combine with desires and eventually lead to the formation of an intention, possibly indeterministically, but that's not important for my argument. And then the intention has to be executed, and you have to have a belief about how to execute it, and eventually that leads to brain events. To suppose that all of this is the ultimate explanation of the data of consciousness is to postulate a very unsimple and so a priori very improbable theory. To go back, why we believe that theory of mechanics is a good theory and can explain things is because it's a simple theory which explains a large number of data. And if you're going to have a very, very complicated theory, you don't suppose it's the ultimate explanation. You've got to look higher. And this is going to be a very complicated theory. Now, before I move on to the issue of whether God would be interested in producing these kind of connections, I want to draw attention to a further feature of these laws. And that is, that they are such that it is immensely unlikely that humans will be able to discover them fully, even if they can discover to some extent statistical regularities which are consequences of those laws. And this is because if you're to discover even one of those laws, you'll need to have a repeatable experiment. You'll need to produce a certain brain event in a certain person, and you'll need to be able to produce just that brain event in another person, or perhaps in the same person at another time, and see what results from that. But of course, you're never going to be able to produce the same event in any other person, or very, very seldom, because very, very seldom indeed does any person have the same brain event as themselves at another time, and very, very, very seldom do they have the same as somebody else, for the simple reason that, well, there are so many possible brain events, but given that the mental events which are produced by them are so many and varied, there's got to be so many and varied brain events, and hence the consequence that follows. Okay. And furthermore, of course, how do we know what are the mental events which someone is having? You need to be quite sure you knew that before you could establish such a law. But to know that, we have to rely on what subjects are telling us. And in the case of sensations, that's not going to be an enormous amount of use, because yes, you can someone may apply the word red to some sensation, and somebody else may, but how do you know they mean the same thing by them? Maybe what looks red to you looks blue to somebody else, and conversely. Now, that's not just a philosopher's suspicion. It's highly likely, really, that what looks red to somebody will look blue to somebody else, because there are colorblind people who can't recognize the difference between two colors, and therefore, if they can't recognize the difference between red and blue, it must be the case that something which looks blue, if somebody can't recognize the difference, it must be either that something that looks red to you looks blue to them, or something that looks blue to you looks red to them. And so it's not extravagant to suppose that there might be a total swap over. It's quite plausible. At any rate, what looks green to somebody may look a little fainter green to somebody else. So again, you can't be certain what the sensations are, and though you might be able to work out just what somebody meant by their propositional events, what they meant by their claim that here is a table, it would take a lot of work to work that out, and a lot of work in consequence of which experiments on one person aren't going to be much use for experiments on another person who understands it in a different way. So, difficulty of finding these things out. And for all these reasons, therefore, I suggest it's immensely improbable that humans will be able to discover the fundamental psychophysical laws. And from all this, it follows that we'll never be able to discover fully the mental life of other people. It's not merely that each person has privileged access to their own mental life, but the access which others have is fairly limited because they can't predict what you will do on the basis of your behavior or even your brains, because they can't establish the laws. So that's what the psychophysical laws are like. How probable is it that God would bring about such laws? Well, humans are good things in virtue of our rationality, in virtue of the rich mental life connected to our bodies, including the ability to understand the world, and in virtue of the choices we can make between good and evil, the good which even God himself, who cannot do evil, does not have, choices which have significant effects on each other and the world. In order to have a large range of choices and the ability to understand the world, we need a mental life of the richness and ability to reason that humans have. In order that our choices may include the choices of whether or not to grow in knowledge and to help others to grow in knowledge, we need to be able to learn from experience and from instruction. Learning from others requires that we improve our concepts, and so we don't have identical ones to start with. And in order to be separate, morally responsible beings who can work out things for ourselves without being subject to excessive influence from outside, we need to have a relatively private mental life of the kind we have. If we didn't have a private mental life, then just think what the situation would be, the 1984 situation. That is, if psychiatrists could just put a machine on your head and work out what you were thinking and what your desires were, and no doubt these would become readily available on the market so that other people could do this sort of thing, then we wouldn't be able to have any secrets. We wouldn't therefore be able to have the choice between being honest and being dishonest. We wouldn't be able to have the opportunity to be moral, to make the moral choice despite prudential reasons to the contrary, because we would always know, somebody else would always know that we'd made the moral choice. So what I'm getting at is, that's not put very well, we often have a choice between doing what is to our advantage and doing what is moral. But doing what is moral may involve doing something which other people will not know about and for which there will not be, therefore, any payoff. But if everybody could know what we were doing and why we were doing, that situation wouldn't arise. Okay, so life would be not a very good sort of place if people could discover what we were thinking about all the time. And God has a reason for giving us all this independence from each other, the reason to have large numbers of choices between large numbers of alternatives and a very rich life, and ability to work out what is good and evil, and ability to work it out independently of other things and tell people if we want to, but not have them looking in on our lives all the time, and so that we can work out things for ourselves without the peer pressure. And so I think God has enormous reason to giving us these complicated psychophysical laws. It's necessary for our existence as free human beings that we have these sort of laws. And so he has every reason to provide them. And so it is well to be expected that if there is a God, there will be these complicated laws connecting our brain life and our mental life. But if there is no God, the suggestion that these might be the ultimate laws, that in addition to the physical laws governing the physical world, say, maybe a dozen such physical laws, or who knows how you count them, there would be these trillions of psychophysical laws additional to that, without explanation, is to suppose something extremely complicated when there is a very obvious rival simple explanation. And so I suggest the argument from pure mental events or from flavors and colors expanded in the way that Al suggested is a very good part of a cumulative case for the existence of God. Thank you.
In typical Swinburnian fashion, with typical Swinburnian precision, he finished literally within 10 seconds of exactly the time limit. It might be a psychophysical law that Swinburne must be precise. That's right. First question goes to Todd Beerus, Baylor University. Can you meet me halfway, buddy? He's a reasonable guy.
So I feel sure you have an answer to this, and I'm just inviting you to share it with us. What do you do with the Leibnizian sorts of considerations that I think are like Leibniz raised to Descartes, that this will involve a host of arbitrariness in God's will? He'll have no particular reason to assign various brain events the job of being associated with the smell of lemon as opposed to the smell of freshly mown grass. So it'll just be a system of laws that's suffused with arbitrariness, and that's unbecoming of a being who should act for sufficient reasons.
Yes, Leibniz thought there was always a unique best thing to do in any situation. I see no reason to believe that at all. We are often, in ordinary life, quite apart from these considerations, we are often faced with choices which are equal best choices. And as you rightly point out, in designing humans, God had a very large number of equal best choices. But my point is, he had very considerable reason for choosing one of a very large number of such possible choices, rather than one of a very large number of non-possible choices that wouldn't serve these aims he had in mind. I mean, he could design, well, firstly, he needn't give humans consciousness, but if he does give humans consciousness, then he could design a far simpler system of psychophysical laws than, in fact, operate. He could, for example, give us identical brains to start with, not merely having the same main bits there, but these bits connected with each other by exactly the same fibers. And he could have arranged so that everybody exposed to the same public phenomenon would cause just the same neural events in the brain, which would lead to just the same beliefs in them. And if he did, then it would be a lot easier to find out what other people were thinking about. And if that was the case, then we wouldn't have privacy in which to work out our lives. So yes, there are a lot of arbitrary choices, but nobody except somebody under the influence of Leibniz's dogma that God wouldn't do any action except unless there is a unique best action, would think that's a problem. And it's pretty obvious in ordinary situations that there are before us many equal best actions, and a perfectly good being will simply arbitrarily choose one.
Okay, Tim McGrew?
This is a small question. I note on lines 18 and 19 that you say it's most unlikely human beings would ever be able fully to discover these psychophysical laws, hence the privacy of our mental lives. I'm wondering if maybe you want to say something slightly stronger than that in view of the definitions you've given on the first three lines, where you define a mental event as one to which one substance, the person whose it is, necessarily has privileged access. The reason that I'm worried is that the weaker claim down low seems to leave it open that that's a contingent matter, but that seems to leave open the possibility that there would be, in the end, no mental events. And that would be unacceptable, I should think.
There's a distinction between privileged access and privacy. My claim that there is no privileged access is a necessary truth about our own experiences. We will always be in a better position than anybody else to know whether we're in pain. But what might be the case in a badly designed universe is that, in fact, if certain brain events in a person, in every person, just a few brain events would always cause a pain. And there could be so many examples of that the doctor would have no hesitation in examining people. Does it really hurt or anything? He'd just put the machine on your head and discover it. You'd still be, formally speaking, in a better position, but in practice, people would know so well that it wouldn't rise.
Right. Can I do one very quick follow-up on that? Does God have access to our mental states?
Now, I have made provision for that in the account. I use the word by experiencing it. God does not experience our mental state. That leaves open the logical possibility that there might be beings of other capacities than humans who have privileged access, not by that route. But clearly we don't and are not capable of it.
Mike Robinson from University of Mary Hardin-Baylor. I run the risk of misunderstanding both you and Robin Collins here, but as I heard you speaking, as I understand what Robin Collins was saying is that discoverability of physical laws is a possible sign of teleology, or for the teleological argument, but it is the non-discoverability of these mental laws or psychophysical laws that also is a sign of teleology. I don't know if is there incongruency there, or just a comment about that. I was wondering.
Well, no, I hope not. God has good reason to produce physical laws which are regular and discoverable, because when we discover them, we can build buildings, we can develop an agriculture, and so on. And we can do all that without there being any danger of the kind that I described. On the other hand, he has reason for making the psychophysical laws very complicated to avoid a certain danger which wouldn't arise in the case of discovery of the physical laws. So both are evidence for the existence of God here.
Which I was a little unclear on what exactly the evidence is here that's supposed to increase the probability of God. So this undiscoverability point is an interesting one, but I thought there was another point you were making, which was just the sheer fact that the true psychophysical theory would be very complicated, would be somehow confirming God's existence. And so I want to see if I got that right, because that doesn't seem to me to be correct, because I mean, it's true that any one psychophysical theory would be very, very unlikely, but that there should be a true psychophysical theory seems to me to be equally likely whether there's a God or there isn't, given that there's all these mental and physical events out there in the world.
Yes, I quite agree with the second point, yes.
Okay.
Sure, given that there are these, to my mind, fairly evident causal relations of a regular kind, only the regularity is a statistical one that we discover, which suggests either that it is basically statistical or that there's an underlying deterministic one. It's clear that there are laws, but in order to discover those laws in their fullness as deterministic laws, which would enable one to discover what other people are thinking about, it's there that the problem arises.
Okay, very good.
Thanks. This is a really neat argument. Here's a
What,
potential...
yours or mine?
Here's a potential worry. I can see the benefits of intentions and beliefs being private. what are the benefits of external sensations being private as well? Wouldn't we expect rather, if the simpler is the more probable, wouldn't we expect simple laws connecting brain events with sensations in the case of external sensations, and then complicated laws in the case of beliefs and desires?
Well, the situation from God's point of view wouldn't be too much worse if what you have said applied, but this just makes it a little easier for us and further respect in which we can have privacy in our mental lives. I mean, some people conceal their headaches for the sake of charity. Some people pretend to be ill for the sake of not having to go to work. This is just one way in which there are further choices open to us between good and evil, and such that we can make these choices without being able to be discovered, and therefore without the public consequences of these choices defeating their purpose.
But wouldn't there also be a benefit in the clarity of these things? So there are choices you can make when you know that somebody has a headache. That gives you the possibility of choosing how to treat them, whether to treat them with the consideration due to someone who has a headache or the consideration due to someone who doesn't have a headache.
Yes, well, God has to make a choice.
We can still limit this further, right? What about if it's just external, pure, things like visual sensations or something?
Yeah, well, of course, there are certain advantages in a certain amount of access to somebody's mental life. My point is that too much of this is going to be problematic. So clearly, God has to weigh up the pros and cons, and we can, to some extent, with reasonable probability, sometimes infer that someone does have a headache. My only point is that if we could do it just like that, straight off, with not a necessary infallibility, but an in practice infallibility, there would be very considerable disadvantages.
Two more questions.
There it is. I also had a question about the structure. I'm just not seeing how the line that starts, hence it is a priori very improbable that if there were no God, there would be no such laws. It seems, so we haven't talked about God at all up to this point in the argument. All we have is that a scientific theory is probably true insofar as it's ... it's simple. Such a theory is not simple, so it seems like the intermediate conclusion is just, hence, it's probably not true. So do you mean to say something like a scientific theory is probably true insofar as it makes many true predictions, no false ones, and is simple, unless we can think of a reason that God would want it to be true despite not making many true predictions or not being simple? Because I'm just at a loss at that point as to how we would see that.
I was assuming, for the sake of giving a half-an-hour argument, that, as it were, there was no other rival explanation of why all of these laws would hold. But clearly, if my general account is right, there won't be another rival explanation of the scientific law kind, because all these concepts that people have are not logically connected with all the other concepts that they have, and that's the problem. But of course, that's not ruling out some malevolent deity, but then he wouldn't have a reason for believing these, or some other quite different sort of cause. But you suggest it, and then we'll consider it. But the obvious alternative around is that God might do that, and I have suggested a strong reason why he might do that.
I have a question about the inferring from the complexity. Actually, I have two questions, but I'll start with this one. Inferring from the complexity of the laws to that they need God as an explanation. What if you thought of the laws are just sort of there at random? So they're just a random laws connecting, let's say, physical states with mental states, and then through the process of evolution, the brains are chosen in such a way that to exploit those laws so that could be creatures with consciousness that can move around. In that case, it seems like you have a randomness explanation. There's no need to invoke God.
Oh, wait a moment. The laws have to be there before...
That one stopped working.
The laws have to be there before natural selection can operate. That is to say, natural selection operates on genes which operate in virtue of the brain states to which they give rise, but natural selection can't determine which brain states lead to which.
No, and I'm not claiming that.
No, I know. So, the laws have to be all there, as it were. Now, what you are rightly pointing out is that natural selection can then take over, and if some brain states lead to some mental events which will lead to our destruction, then, of course, natural selection will select out the people who have these brain states. Yes, but the question remains as to why there should be lots and lots and lots of laws which natural selection can operate on in such a way as to produce us. Because if they were just, if the laws to start with were just random, they wouldn't be, there's no guarantee they'd be puttable together in such a way that we could survive. I mean, it's the usual answer to anyone who says natural selection is responsible for this. Natural selection can only operate on what's there, and the laws have to be there, and there have to be laws such that the laws, any law at all, if it is to give rise to beliefs, will have to give rise to packages of beliefs, and therefore, because you can't have a belief strategies on its own, and therefore the brain state will have to be like that. Yes, you could have such a powerful means of natural selection that everybody had the same brain construction as everybody else. Sure, but then the fact that natural selection doesn't lead to that suggests that in this respect it's designed. And yeah, I don't think I've quite answered all your points, but the basic point is that any attempt to refer to natural selection already presupposes the existence of laws, and the laws have to be such that although some of them are going to lead to our destruction, for example, if they throw up beliefs, I think this is Al's example more or less, if they throw up a belief that there is a tiger in front of you when in fact there's a tiger behind you, and therefore you run away in this direction, you will be eliminated.
So the laws have to be fine-tuned in order.
Yeah.
All right, thank Richard Swinburne.